A 48-hour deadline, power plants on the line, and markets from Hong Kong to London already feeling the tremors. Tonight, the question isn't just what happens in the next few hours, it's what happens after. Here's everything you need to know. Good evening, and welcome. I'm your anchor for today's breakdown. It is day 24 of the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And if you've been following this story, you already know the pace of developments has been relentless. But today, Monday, March 23rd, may be one of the most consequential days of this war so far. A deadline set by US President Donald Trump is set to expire tonight at 23:44 GMT. That's just past 3 in the morning in Tehran. The demand is clear. Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. If it doesn't, Trump has threatened direct strikes on Iran's electricity grid. The region is on edge. Markets are rattled. And the next few hours could determine whether this conflict takes yet another significant turn. Let's break it all down. If you're new here, we cover major global events with clarity and balance. No hype, just the facts. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next update on this story. To understand where we are today, it helps to step back briefly. This conflict, now in its 24th day, was launched by the United States and Israel against Iran. Since then, it has expanded well beyond the borders of any single country, drawing in Gulf nations, involving proxy forces across Iraq and Lebanon, and, as of this week, threatening to disrupt some of the world's most vital energy corridors. The Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has reportedly restricted, is not just a geographic feature. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it. Any prolonged disruption there does not stay in the Middle East. It moves through global supply chains, energy prices, and ultimately into the daily lives of people far from the conflict zone. That is the backdrop against which Trump issued his ultimatum. On Sunday, Iran responded to Trump's threat with a counter-warning of its own. Iranian officials indicated that if the United States follows through on striking Iran's power infrastructure, Tehran would retaliate by targeting the energy and water systems of its Gulf neighbors, a statement that sent an unmistakable signal to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. That warning appears to have already begun materializing. According to reports, Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense confirmed that 2 ballistic missiles were launched toward Riyadh. One was intercepted, the second fell in an uninhabited area. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed responsibility, saying its forces struck Prince Sultan Air Base. In the UAE, the Abu Dhabi media office confirmed that air defense systems intercepted a ballistic missile targeting the capital, and a debris impact injured an Indian national in the Al-Shawamiq area. By Monday, the UAE stated it was actively responding to incoming missile threats from Iran. In Bahrain, an IRGC spokesperson claimed that U.S. Fifth Fleet installations were targeted using missiles and drones. These are not minor incidents. This suggests the war has already extended into a regional dimension that goes well beyond the original Iran-Israel-US triangle. Inside Iran, the situation reports are significant. Israeli military sources stated that a wide-scale wave of strikes targeted infrastructure in and around Tehran. According to verified footage reviewed by Al Jazeera, columns of fire and smoke were visible over the city of Karaj, located west of Tehran. U.S. Central Command, in an official statement, confirmed it targeted a turbine engine production facility in Qom province, which it described as linked to drone and aircraft component production tied to the IRGC. An air attack also reportedly struck residential buildings in Urmia in northwest Iran, with rescue operations underway, according to state-affiliated Noor News. One person was killed in what was described as a U.S.-Israeli strike on a radio transmitter in the port city of Bandar Abbas, according to Iran's Mehr news agency. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has threatened to strike power plants in Israel, and those supplying electricity to U.S. bases in the region, if Iran's own power infrastructure is targeted. That threat is now directly tied to the deadline expiring tonight. The economic shockwaves are already visible. On Monday, stocks in China and Hong Kong were on course for their worst single-day performance in nearly a year. The primary driver, according to analysts, is what's being described as stagflation fears, a combination of slowing growth and rising energy prices, directly tied to the escalating conflict. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Keir Starmer called an emergency meeting to address the mounting economic fallout from the war. That a European head of government is convening emergency sessions over this conflict is a signal of just how far its consequences are reaching. In Lebanon, authorities report that at least 1,099 people have been killed in Israeli strikes since March 2nd, with the World Health Organization noting that more than 100 of those killed were children. In Iraq, at least 60 people have reportedly died so far, the majority of them members of the pro-Iran Popular Mobilization Forces. It's important to acknowledge that this conflict is being viewed through very different lenses depending on where you stand. From the US and Israeli perspective, the strikes on Iranian infrastructure are framed as efforts to degrade Iran's military capabilities and compel it to cease what they describe as destabilizing activities across the region. From Tehran's perspective, these are acts of aggression against a sovereign nation, and Iran's warnings about targeting Gulf energy infrastructure could be read as deterrence messaging, an attempt to raise the cost of further escalation for all parties involved. Gulf states find themselves in a deeply uncomfortable position. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have, in recent years, pursued diplomatic engagement with Iran, yet they now appear to be directly in the line of fire, prompting urgent questions about how they navigate relationships with both Washington and Tehran. At the domestic U.S. level, Senator Chuck Schumer publicly called for an end to U.S. military operations against Iran, while Senator Tim Kaine suggested the operation is being driven by political grievances rather than strategic necessity, a claim that remains a partisan political argument rather than an established fact. As the deadline approaches, several scenarios appear possible, though none are certain. If Iran does not reopen the Strait of Hormuz by tonight's deadline, the United States may follow through with strikes on power infrastructure, which could trigger the retaliatory cycle Iran has already warned about, striking Gulf energy systems and potentially widening the conflict further. Alternatively, back-channel diplomatic pressure from Gulf states, European governments, or other actors could produce some form of compromise or delay, though there is no public indication of that as of now. The third possibility is that the deadline passes with ambiguity, partial reopening, rhetorical repositioning, leaving both sides room to de-escalate without an explicit capitulation. What seems clear is that the coming 24 to 48 hours will be closely watched by governments, markets, and millions of people whose lives are already being touched by this conflict in one way or another. 24 days in, this conflict shows no clear signs of resolution. What began as a U.S.-Israeli operation has expanded into something touching Gulf states, global oil markets, and the political chambers of governments far from the region. Tonight's deadline is a moment, but not necessarily the moment. Wars rarely resolve on the timelines that ultimatums suggest. The more pressing question, perhaps, is not what happens at 23:44 tonight, but what framework, if any, exists for this conflict to end. So far, that answer remains unclear. We'll continue following this story closely and bring you updates as they develop. If this breakdown was useful, please share it and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep doing this work. Stay informed, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next one.